Hungry Trilobyte podcast would like to acknowledge conventions such as WhedonCon. WhedonCon is a fan-generated charity event for Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel, Firefly, and all Joss Whedon creations. It is scheduled for October of 2020 and is held in Los Angeles, California. Portion of the proceeds benefit the Los Angeles LGBT Center, as well as the Ron Glass Memorial Scholarship. See details at WhedonCon.com.
On mic today, we have Shannon Eichorn. How have you been?
Pretty good. How about you?
I am doing fantastic. I am really eager to sit down and talk with you here because going back and forth with you on social media, I've gotten really interested in this book of yours, Rights of Use.
Yay!
And I'm looking forward to sitting down and talking about that.
Awesome. Thank you.
So this book is, I'm interested in your motivation. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
Mostly because reading the history of you writing this book in your blog, it's roughly about the history of how the world, whether we understand there are aliens or not, and it goes over a long period of time, and yet you're not a big fan of history.
No.
And that's unusual for a writer, and definitely unusual for a writer of historical past.
So, where a lot of that came from was that I was trying to convert a fan fiction series.
Mm-hmm.
I had been writing this fan fiction series throughout high school, and as I was getting ready to graduate, my mom's like, "Why don't you just convert it to original fiction?" I'm like, "You can't do that, Mom." So I did.
Simple enough.
Yeah. I was already writing original characters and obviously an original story. So all I had to do was convert the setting, the entire setting of a space opera. So one of the places that I reached out to that to do was a passing interest in UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
So I had heard about Project Blue Book, and I started researching that. And as I was digging into the University of Colorado's final report based on the Blue Book files, I found this curious phrase that actually made it into my final book that talked about, "We assume the Air Force gave us all relevant information." So that leaves a pretty big opening, especially if, your final conclusion is none of this is real and it's not a threat to the country. Well, if I'm going to write about it being real and a threat to the country, then obviously the Air Force didn't give them all relevant files, and it left me a nice opening to build that new world and that new setting.
Sure. And I just find it interesting that putting myself in the perspective of whoever's writing that report, what's my motivation to leave that clause in there?
Well, I see two things from what I've read. One, purportedly, and it's kind of hard to trust, UFO research, the team was mixed and had people with both a pro-extraterrestrials exist bias and an anti-extraterrestrials exist bias. So obviously there would be some sort of tension that they would need to resolve in their final documentation. But also, these were a bunch of scientists and engineers and specialists in their field. They're going to be very thorough and put in all their assumptions like, we assume we know everything, and if not, don't blame us.
Makes sense. So when you want to sit down and write this book, what prompted that? What made you want to do the conversion from fan fiction to actual fiction, aside from your mom?
Over the 5 years that I was working on the fan fiction series, it became really important to me for the themes that I started it in 2002. So it was right after September 11th, and there was all this racism in the US cropping up and being very vocal again. And I had a lot of problems with that. So as I was writing this fan fiction series, from a show that's very, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, I wanted to get into more shades of gray, and do that. And so the whole series became very important to me. And, when I started over rewriting it in 2007, I did it with the intention of going through at least enough of the series to capture that theme. So I guess I didn't really write this book for this book. I wrote this book so I can tell the rest of the story, which is kind of weird.
Well, not really weird, actually.
Okay.
Because I don't read a lot of fan fiction. I'll be very honest with you, but I've written a lot and I talk to people who write a lot, and I don't put it down. I don't disparage it, because there is something to having all the little characters already made for you. The world is set. You just have to set it up and see how it plays out. That's a great writing exercise. And I'm a big fan of that, because it gives you a good way to sharpen your writing skills. It gives you a good way to play with ideas without having to reinvent the wheel over and over again.
Absolutely. It's funny. Somehow I end up doing a fan fiction panel at Marcon every year. And every year we always end up with, this is wonderful stuff and it's good for the community.
Well, sure it is. And really, if you take the premise that only the people who created the characters have the right to work on them, then isn't every Superman story made in the past 30 years fan fiction?
Yep.
Yeah. No, you have to say that once you get to know the character, you have the right to work with it. Maybe not publish it. That's a different ball of wax.
Sure.
But if you can write a good story, write a good story.
Always. And it's from the perspective of, Star Wars or Star Trek or the big franchises. It's kind of the fan fiction that keeps people excited as things are coming in the gaps between releases.
Big time.
It's the fan fiction and the cosplay and the con suite talk.
And that's something we've really forgotten about in the very recent past, because, like, as you're well aware, Star Trek had a dark period between 2005 and 2009, between the end of Enterprise and the beginning of the JJ movie. And Star Wars had an even longer one between the Return of the Jedi and Phantom Menace, where there was just no real new content aside from the comic books and the novels and stuff. But even those were few and far between.
I love the novels.
Yeah. Haven't read a lot of them on the war side. Star Trek, I have a library. But the fact is that you had to embrace the fan community if you wanted anything.
Right.
Growing up in the 90s, I took it as an article of faith that there were 3 Star Wars movies and that was it. And that's all there ever would be.
4, 5, and 6?
Yeah.
I believe that too. Even when I was little,
Go ahead.
I was 10 when Phantom Menace came out, so I didn't have a whole lot to, wait.
Ah, okay.
But, it was still a big shock when it was released, when the news was released.
Yeah, and I said, as somebody who I was 2.5 when Return of the Jedi came out. So, and I was 18 when Phantom Menace came out. And like I said, most of my childhood and my teen years was like, there's no more Star Wars. They're done making Star Wars. Star Wars is a trilogy. And if you didn't get into everything else, you you didn't have much to go on.
Sure. Makes a
And
lot of sense.
and that's what we're missing now is that, you know, Disney's cranking them out every year, and there's 3 different Star Trek productions in just this year alone, and I love that, but don't forget what life was like just a few years ago.
I gotta say, I feel now that I'm writing more, I feel very disconnected from that. I spend so much time working on my own works that I get to stop and enjoy the franchises that I love, but the only time I really participate in fandom is in conventions.
Sure. Well, let me ask you this, and this is the first time you and I ever really had a conversation, so I don't know this,
Okay.
but are there any recent Star Wars movies you weren't super crazy about?
Maybe.
Okay. Do you spend a lot of time on the internet pissing and moaning about that?
I don't.
Really? So by actually having something to create yourself, you're not so inclined to be negative on something else.
I feel like I left my fandom.
No, go ahead.
I feel like, you know, I lived Star Wars and I breathed Star Wars, and then I went to SG1 and I lived SG1 and breathed SG1, and then I just didn't have time for an intense fandom anymore. I'm kind of sad about that. So when the new Star Wars movies came out, and you know, 70 episode 7 was a great J.J. Abrams adventure, and I could appreciate it for its good parts and know that that's what it was going to be. And then Rogue One came out, and it was like the best Star Wars movie ever. And it was like the X-Wing series. But it's working on the intense series that I'm working on, with a day job and everything. Like, I feel free to just.
So you were saying you left the fandom?
Oh wow. Okay. That part all recorded on my end, but
Okay.
that was a long time ago.
Okay, I'm looking forward to listening to it then. I would say, I mean, did you leave the fandom, or did you just make it better by not getting petty about some things?
Both. I'm a lot less engaged with all the things that are coming out. I was really excited about the tie-in between. Disney is doing a lot of book and on-screen tie-ins right now, and that was something that I always felt was missing. So I'm very excited about that, even though I'm not engaging in it.
Mm-hmm.
So from that perspective, if I'm not participating, then I'm not really in that deep in the fandom. But I don't think I'm dragging it down by being able to say, yeah, there are flaws, and I know that here are the good parts that I enjoyed, and there are other things out there that are also amazing.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. The point I was kind of getting at was that, I found that people, once they start to really get creative on their own and start to kind of create their own little pet projects, they're a lot more forgiving when they don't like how a certain character resolved an arc, or they don't like how many action figures were made out of a certain. They let the little stuff go, and I think that's good for everybody.
I think it is. I think it's a lot easier to say, oh, that got missed in editing, or that was, a dramatic choice. For example, I went to see episode 9 with my sister. She's going to shoot me when she hears this. And she was very, very upset about the ending, which I had tried to tell her beforehand. Star Wars has these established patterns, and I don't think they're going to deviate from that one.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to our fan fiction discussion, we got home from the theater and I started writing fix-it fic for her.
Nice. That's a good gift.
Yeah. And it takes the whole Jedi off in a direction that is consistent with the extended universe and with the on-screen mythology, but has never been explored. And I was really excited about that. And, I think I'm on the list of people that if someday they let me write for Star Wars, I would totally jump at it.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, there's always fan fiction.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic way to approach it. Like I said, I like the term fix-it fiction. I've never heard that before, but I like it a lot.
There's all these opportunities to write alternate realities or bring an arc back around or fill in a gap between episodes.
I mean, and there was a time, and this is actually before my time, so I'm literally saying there was a time because it wasn't but the first few generations of Star Trek conventions, they would have entire tables full of fan fiction that was bound and printed because it's like, well, we had a 3-season show and then a cartoon series and there's nothing after that. So a cottage industry started up on people making what you're now calling fix-it fic. That's like, well, what happened to Khan? And, what happened to the ship after the show ended? And is this person really in love with that person? Some people stepped up, and this was huge because, like I said about Star Wars, for a while, nobody thought there would be anything else.
Right. Fanzines, the good old days of fanzines. Mm-hmm. I've heard of it. I know people who have participated, but
it's definitely different, and to an extent.
To an extent? What's the problem?
I was just saying, I see the value in having printed stories as well.
True.
Well, Shannon, it looks like we're having some trouble all the way around here. But I think we're really having a good discussion here. Maybe we should both take some notes and get back together real soon and maybe make a part 2 to this discussion.
I think that would be all right.
Awesome. Well, where can people check out your book and your adventures on the internet?
All right. My book is available right now on Amazon mostly, and also the bookshop in Lakewood, which is doing interesting things to be able to handle the current situation.
Okay.
For the audio folks, it's called Rights of Use, Project Black Book Volume 1. It's available, like I said, Amazon, Kindle, and Audible, and pretty much any audiobook vendor you can think of.
I'm going to make sure all that gets put in the show notes on my website,
Awesome.
And especially that bookshop there. Hope we can help them out a little bit. Thank you so much for being here, and I would like to have this part 2 after I read your book so I can talk about some of the details on that too.
That would be a blast.
Okay. I will talk to you soon. Take good care,
all right.
Okay?
Take care.